Hello and welcome to this new session. In this session, we're going to see the API endpoint, API call, and LLM assistance tips, tricks, or some common issues that you can face when you are using these components. Let's start with the API endpoint component, and let's make some clarifications about this API endpoint component. Okay, the first thing is that the default method that we have in this component is the post. So in most of the cases, you're going to use the naming convention for your extra outputs, body dot input parameter. The same for this. So you can get used to use always the body default output, but no, that's not true in all the cases. For example, if you just change the method to get, you are going to use the query default output because that's where the information of your input parameters is going to be placed. So your extra outputs are going to be named like this, query dot something. But we have a third default output that is called headers. And yes, you can do the same with this default output. If you have some information that you want to extract from this default output, you can name or you can create a new output with the same naming convention. Headers, some headers dot and the name of the key parameter that you want to extract from the headers object. So with that said, there's another clarification. When you use the API endpoint component and you are creating your custom outputs, you can think that the naming convention is query dot the name of the input parameter or body dot the name of the input parameter. But that's not always the case. Let's see an example. In this API endpoint component, we can see that the extra output has the name of body.input.tags. Well, as you know, this format of the name is using a JSON path notation. So that means that inside the body object, we are going to the input object, and inside of the input object, we are going to the tags. So that means that inside of the input object, we have a tags object or a tags key. So let's check what we have in the input. In the input, we have set a default value called object, and let's check what we have in that agent variable. We have this sample object. If we check this object, we have many parameters, and here we have the tags parameter. So that's why I am using that notation in here, because you can take advantage of this notation if you are receiving, for example, in this case, an object in your input. Instead of, I don't know, using another components to filter and to extract the tags key from your input, you can do it directly in the custom output just by following this notation. Let's run this. And you can see that we extract the tags from that object in the input. Then check. We have here the tags, and inside of this parameter, we have an array with these elements. So that's what we have here. So you can take advantage of this JSON path notation. If you receive an object in your input, well, you can extract the values following this notation. Okay, another, well, a tip that I see some users has some problems is about how to handle arrays. Let's see this scenario where you are going to receive a list of some elements in your input parameter, and you want to pass that list to a for each component. And well, the for each component always needs an array. So some users has problems making that conversion of a list to an array. And well, there's a trick that you can use to do this. Well, you have your input parameter. In this case, it's called list, and you can set the type to array. Now we have this extra output that is going to extract that list from the body, and that is passed to the for each component. Well, let me just add this here to make the execution. Okay. So we're going to execute. We have here any kind of list. This list is not, well, this doesn't have the structure of an array. But since the type of the input is set to array, if we check the output of the API endpoint component, we can see that we have an array. And this array is correctly structured to be used in a for each component. If you can see, the for each component recognize the array that we have in this output. So this is a trick if you want to pass some list and we want that list to be converted to an array because we want to iterate through the elements of that list. So this is a trick that you can use. Just set the input to array type, and you're going to have an array in the output. Okay, another scenario related to the API endpoint component. This scenario is about receiving binary data in your API endpoint component. So in here we have an input called file, and the type is binary. And we have our extra output that's going to extract that value. So what if in our workflow, in our agent, we want the base 64 value of this binary data that we are receiving in the API endpoint? So, because as you know, if we run this component and we send any file, what we have here is this information, like a URL where the file was uploaded, the size, and the MIME type. So what if I want the base 64 information of this binary data? Because right now I don't have it. Well, a trick is to set the type of the input that is going to receive this binary data. In this case, we're using an LLM prompt, but this can be any other component. Well, we set this input to the type of string. Just by setting that that change in the input, we're going to convert the binary data that we are receiving, and we're going to get the base 64 string. Well, and for this example, we are just setting this to echo, and we're just going to print the input that we are receiving. So let's try it. We upload a file. We have that information. That information is sent to this LLM prompt component, and this input is set to a string type. Let's execute. And what we have here is the base 64 string. So this is a trick. If you want to get the base 64 string for a file or binary data that you receive in some API endpoint that you have, you can use this trick. You can set the input to the type of string, and the conversion is going to be made. Okay, well, what we are seeing now is the content writer agent template that we have in the template section. And I'm using this just to make some clarification. Because there are some users, well, let's see now what we have here. This agent is capable of writing an article, and we have two endpoints. One is in charge of creating the outline, and the other one is in charge of creating the full article, taking the outline that was generated by this other endpoint. So some people wonder why it's divided in two, and how the information that, in this case, the generated outline is passed to this other endpoint, because in this workflow we don't see any kind of connection between these two endpoints. So the reason of how this is happening is because this agent was made to be used through the chatbot interface, the chatbot embodiment, this one that we have in this middle-S. So this chatbot by itself is an LLM, is an AI. So the one who decides which of this endpoint is going to be called and how is it going to be called is the chatbot. So when I request this agent to write a full article, the chatbot is going to see the behavior that we set in the agent, the name of the endpoints, the instruction that we have here. So just by watching this information, the chatbot is going to decide which of this endpoint is going to be called. So when we request to write a full article, well, the agent is going first to create the outline, and once we have all the information needed about the generated outline, the chatbot is going to pass that information and is going to call this other endpoint to generate the full article. So this brings another question to the table. So when you start building an agent, you have to ask to yourself how I am going to interact with this agent. I'm going to interact with this agent through the chatbot embodiment, like this. Or maybe I just want to execute the API endpoints directly. So for example, in this case, we want an agent to write a full article. If I am going to interact with this agent through the chatbot embodiment, well, I can say, yes, I can have multiple endpoints, like in this scenario, one to create the outline, and then the chatbot is going to be in charge of pass that information to write the full article. And I can have another API endpoint, I don't know, to publish this to WordPress, or maybe another endpoint to publish to another platforms. I don't know. You can have all that kind of options. But on the other hand, if I want just an agent that is going to write a full article, and I'm going to interact with that agent just by executing the API endpoint, so in that case, having multiple endpoints is not a great idea. I think it's better to have it only one API endpoint to write the full article, maybe to publish directly to WordPress as a draft. And well, I'm going to review the draft later. So in that case, yeah, it's better to have one endpoint and that's it. So yeah, that's some clarification. When you start building an agent, you just ask to yourself how I am going to interact with that agent. I am going to use the chatbot, or I am going to just execute the API endpoint. Okay, now let's let's see some tips for the API call component. I'm just gonna give some suggestions to help debugging these components when you face some errors. Okay, so one tip is to always have this error output, because as you know, the error messages that you're going to retrieve when you execute an API call component and that API call failed, well, those error messages are going to be placed in this error output. But another place where you can have information is the debug log window. Here you're going to find all the information that you are sending when you are making that API call, and how that information is sent to that API call. So, for example, let's make an example. In this case, this API call just retrieve random information about users. And we have here some query parameters. So let's say that this number 3 is going to be sent using an input. So you're gonna place that that input here. So to be sure that the information that we are sending to that API call through this input, let's set 4, the number 4, to see if that value of 4, the number 4, is sent correctly, and the value was set correctly when we execute the API call component, when we can check the logs, and we're going to see the information in here. And in this case, we want to know that this 4 or that value of the input is replaced correctly in the execution, so we can check the logs. And as we can see, yeah, the input value was set correctly. So the logs are really useful, because you have to make sure that the information to make the API call execution is set correctly. Okay, another thing that you have to know and be really careful is the data type. Well, first, whenever you are going to do an API call, well, make sure to read the documentation of that API call to make sure what's the data that it requires and the data type that it requires. Because, I don't know, maybe the API call component, well, the API call that you're going to use in the component is going to need a Boolean value. So in that case, you have to be sure that you set the input that you're going to use in the API call as Boolean. So by doing this, you're gonna make sure that the information, the data that you are sending through that input value is going to be treated as Boolean. So yeah, be careful with that. Always read the documentation, review the documentation of the API call that you're going to do, and send the information correctly. Then, well, we also have the auth method of authentication. And well, we have default setups for Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, but we also offer the option to set up any other service that use the auth 2 or the auth 1 type of authentication. From this section, I can suggest that you always be sure to add the callback URL. That's a common issue that can happen to you, that you set all the information, the keys, the secret key, all the information you set up correctly, but you have to be sure to set up the callback URL. This is the callback URL that you have to use, and set this URL in the service that you want to use. Okay, then proxies. You can also use proxies in the API call component. We support HTTP and SOCKS 5. The proxies settings, you can find it in the advanced section. Just make sure to follow the rules to set up these proxies. Like, for example, if you want to set up multiple proxy URLs, you have to set each one in a new line. Another thing about these proxy URLs, well, if these proxies requires authentication, well, you can also use the vault to keep that information safely saved. And yeah, the setup is really straightforward. You just have to set up the URL. If you are using authentication for the proxies, you can set it. You can save that information in the vault, and yeah, that's it about the proxies. Okay, now we are going to see the LLM assistant, and the functionality of this component is really straightforward. It's an LLM, but it can remember the conversation that you're going to have with this component. You can use the user ID or the conversation ID to organize this conversation history. And yeah, that's really it. So for this section, I'm just going to show an example about what you can do with this component. For example, in this case, we're going to create an agent that makes conversation about cats. So for the agent, we have these rules. For example, for any interaction, we are going to call the cat's endpoint, which is this one. This is done because we want all the conversation to be saved in the LLM assistant. And then we're going to ask for the cat's owner name, because we are going to use that name as a user ID. So each conversation that the users have with this agent are going to be saved and organized by the name of the user. And there's another rule that we're going to process the name in lowercase. This to avoid confusion, because if the user provides a name in uppercase, well, it can confuse the LLM assistant, because it's going to save the conversation as another user. So to avoid this, we're going to handle all the names in lowercase to avoid those problems. And in the API endpoint, we just have the name that is going to be the cat owner's name, and the user input that is going to be the question or whatever interaction that the user have with the agent. And that name, as you can see, goes to the user ID, and the user input go to the user input of the LLM assistant. And in the LLM assistant, we also have these rules that start a conversation about cats and utilize the conversation history to add context to the discussion. So let's try it. Okay, we're going to interact, or we're going to test this agent, and we're going to interact as John. Okay, we're going to restart the chatbot, and now we're going to interact as, I don't know, Albert. Okay, so now we have two conversations, in one as John and the other one as Albert. So now what happened if I start uh, interacting with the agent as John? And as you can see, the the agent can remember my well, the name of my cat. So it means that it's retrieving that conversation history from the LLM assistant. So let's start this. And what happens if I interact again as Albert? Okay, and also as you can see, it can remember the conversation that we had previously. So this is an interesting scenario if you are thinking about an agent uh, that can handle the conversation for each user, and every time that the user interacts again with the agent can remember the conversation history that they had previously. So yeah, in that case, if you want that behavior, yeah, the LLM assistant is a component that you can use for that purpose. And that's it. That's it for this session. Feel free to post any kind of question in the Discord server if you want, or if you feel that some scenario was not covered here. Yeah, we can cover in another session, or I can answer directly in the Discord server. So well, thank you so much, and see you in another